wonderful to attract men. They're always giving me things like these beautiful flowers. I guess it's because I'm so young and sexy. So much so that men just can't take their eyes or their hands off me. Oh, thank you, my dear man. I just got more. I just can't imagine being anything other than young and sexy. It defines me. And while I'm used to being surrounded by men who want my attention and consider me the object of their affection, I'm also glad to be here with you madams today. It's always so nice when a group of older, wiser women like yourselves wants to spend time with a younger, sexier woman like me. I guess you find me sexy just like the men do. And I like spending time with my non-contemporaries. Now, you know I'm not young and I'm definitely not sexy, but pretending to be sets the stage for our tutorial today. I'm Menopause Taylor, and I'm old, 62. And truth be told, the very reason I have these beautiful flowers is that I am filming this video on my 62nd birthday. And I've received these beautiful bouquets because I'm old and crippled, not because I'm young and sexy. But we're talking about cervical cancer. We're tackling a great big unit on cervical cancer. And the topic for today is how to know if you're at risk for cervical cancer. And since cervical cancer is a disease of young women, I thought it would be fun to mimic one. This is a very important video, and you definitely need to watch it even though I don't cover cervical cancer at all in either of my books, first edition or second edition. And the reason I don't include it in my book is because it is not a disease of menopausal women. And my book is all about menopause. But you will get the very best education on menopause by using my book in conjunction with these videos. And there are some things that are only in the videos. So this is video number 341, and it's just the second video in our cervical cancer unit. The first video was an overview comparing endometrial uterine cancer to cervical cancer. And in that video, I introduced you to the fact that although your endometrium and your cervix belong to the same organ, the cancers that develop from them are very, very different. And one of the most blatant differences between them is the profile of the woman who is at risk for each. So take a look at the chart we created last week. Focus on the bright yellow row. It designates the prototype of the women who get endometrial uterine cancer compared to the prototype of the women who get cervical cancer. You see that the typical woman who gets endometrial uterine cancer is old and fat, while the typical woman who gets cervical cancer is young and sexy. So let's expound on that and consider the other risk factors that contribute to a high risk of cervical cancer. Now, if you take another look at that chart and focus on the item just below the bright yellow one, you will see the risk factors for both cancers. Notice that endometrial uterine cancer has only 3 risk factors, while cervical cancer has 11 risk factors. Now, I know that the font size in the cell for cervical cancer risk factors is too tiny for you to decipher with your little old eyes if you're old and not at risk for cervical cancer. So here's an enlargement of that list. The risk factors for cervical cancer include young age at first intercourse, more than one sexual partner, history of a sexually transmitted disease, many pregnancies, cigarette smoking, chronic immune suppression, DES exposure, DES meaning diethylstilbestrol, history of an abnormal pap smear, infrequent pap smears, and living in an underdeveloped country. Now, when you look at that whole list, the overall impression is one of a lifestyle that is typical of a young, sexy woman of lower socioeconomic status because she lives in an underdeveloped country. Such a woman is more likely to start having intercourse at a young age. She's more likely to have more than one partner. And she's more likely to be exposed to sexually transmitted diseases because she has more than one partner. And if she starts having intercourse at a young age while living in an underdeveloped country, she's not likely to have access to birth control, which would increase the likelihood of her getting pregnant at a young age. And if she starts having children at a young age, she is more likely to have many children. And if she lives in an underdeveloped country, she is not likely to have access to pap smears as a screening test for cervical precancer. So you can see how many of these risk factors go together and create the prototype of the woman who gets cervical cancer. Now, some of the other risk factors, like chronic immune suppression and DES exposure, are predispositions for the transformation of normal cells into cancer cells. DES is an acronym for diethylstilbestrol, which is a synthetic estrogen that some women used to take in order to get pregnant. And a predisposition for transformation of cells from normal to cancers is a possible risk factor for a lot of cancers, not just cervical cancer. Smoking is common in underdeveloped countries as well as in developed countries. And smoking increases your risk of cervical cancer by 3.5 times. Finally, there's a history of an abnormal pap smear, which will make perfect sense to you when you watch the next 6 videos in this unit. And notice that unlike endometrial uterine cancer, hormones have no influence on cervical cancer at all. Other than the indirect influence of being young and sexy, cervical cancer is not a disease that is associated with any particular hormonal state. Instead, it's all about your sexual history. I like to say that cervical cancer is a sexy disease, but I don't mean it the way it sounds. There is definitely nothing sexy about having cervical cancer. What I mean is that your sexual behavior dictates your risk for cervical cancer. The more active you are sexually, the higher your risk. It's a disease of young, sexy women with very active sex lives. That's not the typical scenario for most menopausal women. Nope. In fact, most menopausal women tell me that they have no interest in sex at all. I can't even count the number of times I've heard menopausal women say that they don't care if they ever have sex again. So things change over time with sexual interests and with cancer risks. When you're young and sexy, you're at risk for cervical cancer. When you become old and fat, you're at risk for endometrial uterine cancer. There's just no winning, is there? So the summary for today is that the risk factors for cervical cancer stem from your sexual history when you're young and sexy. And in the upcoming videos, I'll explain why this is the case. So thank you for putting up with my pathetic attempt at being sexy. I have never been sexy. I pretend to be when I want to get someone to laugh, because that's how non-sexy I am. Once, when I was leaving the gym and I got into the elevator with a woman whom I had met at the gym, something funny happened. We'd become friendly, and she had complimented me on my yoga practice as she had seen me doing it in the gym. And she and I both showered at the gym, so we were in the habit of seeing each other in our sweaty workout clothing and then transforming ourselves into well-groomed ladies. And she was this tall, young Asian woman with beautiful long black hair, and she always wore black clothing and very high heels. In other words, she was sexy. I, on the other hand, always wore my typical Victorian attire, my short heels, my hat, my gloves. So she looked like a modern bombshell, and I looked like I belonged in the 1800s. Well, when we got into the elevator, she said, "Barbie, you are so sexy." And I was just taken aback. Nobody has ever told me I'm sexy. People have always admired me for my brain, not my body. So when she complimented me by saying I was sexy, I just started laughing. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "I've never been sexy a day in my life. There's absolutely nothing sexy about me." And she said, "That's not true. I've seen you do yoga, and you are definitely sexy when you do yoga." So I paused a moment, I cocked my head a bit, and I responded with, "That's not sexy, that's arthritis." And with that, we both fell into gales of laughter. I think I won that debate. I am not sexy. But actually, there are some men who find me sexy. The ultra old guys. When a 99 or 100-year-old man sees me from afar, he'll be shuffling down the sidewalk, and when he sees me, he just stops and freezes. And as he stands there staring and swaying, I take him back to yesteryear, when women wore long dresses, hats, and gloves. A couple of times, one of these ultra old guys has actually gotten close enough to me to whisper in my ear, "You look pretty as a picture." And that's about as close as I ever get to being sexy. Okay, so this was a short and sweet video today. Next week I'll teach you about the anatomy of your cervix as it relates to cervical cancer, and I think you'll really enjoy that video. If you'd like a copy of the chart, you can find it via the link in the description box, or you can go to menopausetailor.me where you'll find all my charts. And it's the same one I showed you last week, so hopefully you already have it. Be sure to go to menopausetailor.me to schedule a consultation no matter what your situation. There is nothing better than having all the facts tailored specifically to you, and that is precisely what I do in all consultations. There's no tailoring on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram, but you can find me there. And there's no tailoring here on YouTube in the comment box because you have to have me to yourself for that. But you should subscribe anyway. And don't forget that I send out a newsletter every 2 weeks, and you should subscribe to it too. It's informal and informative. Please come back here to YouTube in a week because I have a lot more to teach you, despite how young and sexy I am. Bye!